Well, the story of Job that we've been going through for the last 6 weeks or so is the story of a man who lost it all in an instant. He lost his children, he lost his fortune, he lost his good name, and then he started to wrestle with some big issues, as you might expect him to wrestle when you go through calamity like that. But for Job, he wasn't wrestling with atheism. There never seems to be any question in the book of Job, in Job's mind, about whether God existed. Job knew that God exists, that he knew that he's powerful, but there was some serious question in Job's mind about whether God is good, whether God is who he thought he was all along, whether God governs the world the right way. And so Job didn't struggle to believe that God exists. He struggled to trust God. And that kind of struggle isn't unique to him. I mean, hopefully we won't experience suffering like Job experienced, but for us, as life grinds on, as we experience real evil in the world, as there's real pain and real suffering in our lives, at times it would be easy for us to say, I'm out on God. Like, yeah, there must be a creator, but he can't possibly be relied upon. He can't possibly be the one that I thought that he was. He must not be involved in creation anymore. He's surely not hearing my prayers. He can't be good because there's so much bad out there. We can start to think that way. And we can get to a place where maybe we would never stop saying that we believe in God, but we just stop trusting him. And you know that because we don't pray. We don't read the Bible. We quietly in our minds kind of curse that old life that we had with God, and we just settle for a cynical agnosticism or performative, empty, insincere religion. But Job didn't want that. I mean, he went through pain and unexplainable loss. He had no idea why he was going through all this, but he continued to cling to God and continued to seek God. His wife was there telling him, Job, just curse God and die. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cling to God. I want to find him. I want to know him. God's become so confusing to me, but I want to see him again. I want that relationship with him again. And so we need to learn what Job learned in this story. We need the answers that he gets from God if we're going to continue to trust God, or if we're going to come to the place where we trust him again after a long time away, after calamity has come into our lives. And so today we'll tie up some loose ends in the storyline of Job, and then we'll begin to unpack some of the answers that God gives to Job at the end of this book, at the end of his suffering, and hopefully these will be some answers that help us in our suffering, in our calamity, to maintain our trust in God. And just so you know up front, this is actually going to be an incomplete sermon. This is part 1 of 3, basically. 3 sermons this week, next week, and the week after. We'll be trying to answer the question of how can we trust God again when we've wandered through so much brokenness and loss in our lives. And so where we pick up in the story, Job's friends have come to him. They came to him to try to comfort him and also to elicit some repentance. Because remember, in their minds, you don't suffer like Job suffers without having done something really bad. Like, you must have sinned big to have all of this calamity come into your life. God only allows really bad things to happen to really bad people. And they didn't know what Job did, but they knew that he must have done something. So they come to try to comfort him. They try to confront him. And their message is essentially, Job, just fess up. Come clean. Admit your great sins, because the Almighty doesn't allow this kind of suffering unless you've done something really bad. God is just, so you must have done something to deserve this. But Job stands his ground. He doesn't claim absolute perfection, but he says, I didn't do anything more than anybody else to deserve this. I have been righteous. He's not going to apologize for something that he didn't do. He says, I don't deserve this. I have been innocent, and therefore, God must be unjust or cruel, or indifferent or absent. And he says some things in his assessment of God that sound blasphemous. One commentator summed up the things that Job said about God by saying that Job accused God of being, quote, a merciless hunter, an insidious spy, a capricious destroyer, and a sinister ruler. He goes on, he said that Job thought that God is an amoral tyrant who takes delight in destroying lives. And you can hear this in the text. Listen to Job 9, verses 22 to 24. Job speaking, and he says, it's all one. Therefore I say, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. God's not a just judge. He destroys good people, he destroys bad people. He's a destroyer. He says, when disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. He says, they're just laughing when these horrible things come into my life. The earth is given into the hands of the wicked. He covers the faces of its judges. There's no justice here. And if it's not he, then who then is it? So he says, God does not rule justly. He destroys innocent people and wicked people. God's a destroyer of the earth. He's a bringer of calamity. He laughs at people when they're in their distress, when disaster brings death into their lives. And he gives the whole world to wickedness to run amok and to wicked people to run the place. So Job is feeling like he's been the victim of God's poor rule over all of creation. But even in his despair, he does have some hope. He has some hope that one day, somehow, this will be set right. That one day, he won't look at God as his enemy anymore, but he'll be once again reunited with his old divine friend. In fact, listen to this glimmer of hope that he gives in Job 19. He says in Job 19, verse 23, a funny verse, he says, "Oh, that my words were written, that they were inscribed in a book." Which is a funny thing to say in the book of Job. Like he's saying, man, I wish we could write all my words down into a book and we could call it the book of Job or something. And I wish we could write these down. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. And listen to what he clings to in this. He says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me." So he wanted his words to be written down kind of as an exhibit to be used in court. Because he believed that he had a redeemer, Hebrew goel. It was someone, an advocate, who would come and argue for Job before the bench of God's justice. He had confidence that somehow there was someone who could bring his case before God so that even after he died, when his skin had been destroyed, when he was no more, that he would one day again see God. In verse 25, when he's talking about the creator or the redeemer, and he says, "At last he will stand upon the earth," that's better translated, "At last he will triumph over the dust." And when Job talks about the dust in chapter 7, verse 21, he's talking about the dust of death, like the dust that's thrown over a body in the grave. And so kind of cryptically here in chapter 19, Job's saying, I have a redeemer. I have a redeemer who will stand on the earth, who will triumph over death, who will argue my case before God, and at the end, because of the work of that redeemer, I will see God. And I don't know how much Job knew what he was saying here. I mean, we have the advantage as readers here of knowing a whole lot more than Job knew about Job's story. And we see the first couple chapters where we know why Job's suffering. We saw the throne room of God and what happened there. And we also know what the rest of the Bible says about who this Redeemer is. We know that we do have one who went down to the dust of death and then triumphed over death and argues our case before God and reconciles us to God. Job didn't seem to know how that was all going to work, but he doesn't give up hope that somehow his Redeemer would set things right. And he doesn't give up his claim that he's been far too innocent to deserve this kind of suffering. So you get to chapter 32, and Job and his three friends are at loggerheads here. Job is not going to be convinced that the suffering is his fault, and his friends will not be convinced that it's not his fault. So they give up. Job 32, verse 1, it says, "So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes." They're like, fine, Job, you're right. Fine, we'll just stop. We've done this for 32 chapters. We'll stop going back and forth with us saying, yes, you did, and you saying, no, you didn't. We'll stop. But good news, a fourth friend shows up. And so Job 32, verse 2, there's this other guy. We haven't heard about him at all in this book. Apparently he's wearing camo or something, comes out from behind the curtains. He has been unseen and unheard until this point. And so in Job 32, verse 2, it says, "Then Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. And he burned with anger at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. So Elihu is young. We haven't heard from him yet, and that's because he's young. He was letting the older, wiser guys speak. But as he listened to the back and forth, he became increasingly angry. He was angry at Job for not admitting that he must have sinned, and angry at the three friends for not being able to convince Job that he had sinned. And he becomes increasingly convinced that he could do a better job than those old guys. So Elihu comes in, he's kind of like the young TikTok influencer, and he's like, I'm going to repackage this, I'm going to make it young and energetic, I'm going to bring my case, and I'm going to be able to convince Job, and he had enough. Now it's time for him to speak. There's a great line in chapter 32, verse 19, where he's describing like these words building up inside of him, and he says, behold, my belly is like wine that has no vent, like new wineskins ready to burst. I must speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. She's like, my thoughts inside of me are fermenting, and it's like they're in a wineskin, and there's no vent, and the gases are building up, and they're ready to burst, and so now I got to speak. And so now he bursts, and he spews his angry thoughts at Job. He didn't have Twitter, so he had to do this in person, and he comes, and he brings it to him with youthful zeal and passion, and he actually scores a couple of points, may have said some wise things that the friends didn't observe, but ultimately, he makes the same case that they do. Job 34:11, he says, for according to the work of man, God will repay him, and according to his ways, he will make it befall him. His argument's younger and more enthusiastic, but essentially he just says, Job, you deserve it all. And so after 5 chapters of Elihu venting, nobody ever replies to him, and it's like at this point in the story, everybody's just saying, all right, we're done. No more back and forth, no more round and round, we're not getting anywhere. And as you read through the book of Job, you probably felt a sense of almost like frustration and exhaustion with this story. Where it's like, we just keep doing this. It's like we're supposed to be sick of this book by now. We're supposed to be sick of this endless round and round. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. There is no solution until God speaks. And God's going to make 2 speeches at the end of Job. They're the longest speeches that God makes to a mortal in all of the Bible. And after the first speech, Job will shut his mouth and be quiet. And after the second speech, Job will repent and worship and have his trust and his fellowship with God restored. And what God says here about his good rule over all creation is not only some of the most beautiful poetry that's ever been written, but it's a huge comfort that restores Job's trust in God. And we desperately need these answers. We need these answers because they can help restore our trust in God too. And so Job 38, verse 1, it says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And he said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. So the Lord answers Job. Now, earlier in this book, Job was just kind of like dreaming about what it would be like if God ever did answer him. If he ever did get to go and bring his complaint before God, and this is what he predicted. Back in Job chapter 9, he said if he ever got to talk to God, this is how it would go. Job 9:16, if I summoned him and he answered me, obviously that's not going to happen, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not let me get my breath, but fills me with bitterness. If it's a contest of strength, behold, he is mighty. If it's a matter of justice, who can summon him? Though I am in the right, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I'm blameless, he would prove me perverse. So Job's saying, I would love a chance to argue my case before God, but honestly, we know how that would go. He wouldn't listen. He wouldn't let me get a word in edgewise. He would just bully me. He'd just keep wounding me without cause. And I know I'm right, but he's God, so he would just run circles around me. He'd make me say I'm wrong. He'd be cruel. He'd make it look like this was all my fault. He'd even get me to admit it's all my fault when I know it's not all my fault. God would just humiliate me and own me, even if I ever could speak with him. And then he says, because he's God and I'm not, what are we going to do, like wrestle? If we're going to do a contest of strength here, behold, he's mighty. He's going to win. He'll just bully me and shut me down. So even if I could talk to him, it wouldn't go well. But then God answers Job. And when it says that he answers him, he uses the same word to describe what he's doing that he used to describe what the friends did. That the friends come along and answer him. So God isn't just coming along and bowling Job over, like Job had said he would do. He answers him like a friend. Now, you might expect God to immediately just lay Job out, because Job has been saying some really harsh things about God. In Job 16, verse 2, he says, I was at ease, and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He has set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. So Job's been talking some serious smack about God behind his back here. But it's never behind his back. It's never unheard, and I'm sure Job didn't expect God to answer, and you can imagine how much his stomach sinks when God responds to those things that he says. I mean, dang God, I'm sorry, I accidentally hit reply all. That wasn't like meant for you. I didn't know that we were going to be actually dealing with these things. And so you'd expect God to come in and say, Job, you arrogant little fool. I'll give you something to cry about. I slash your kidneys, bring me your kidneys. Here, let me show you. Let me show you. But he very gently, in chapter 38, verse 2, says, your words were without knowledge. It's a pretty mild response to the things that Job has said. Regardless of the tone, it's nowhere near the equivalent of Job's tone as he's pouring out these accusations on God. So he comes to him kindly, and then he says, who is this that darkens counsel? And when that phrase, who is this, is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, it's not to get information, but it's actually to express a tone of awe. So for example, in Jeremiah 46, verse 7, it says, who is this, rising like the Nile, like rivers whose waters surge? Egypt rises like the Nile, like rivers whose waters surge. In Psalm 24, verse 8, who is this King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. And now Job comes and he stands before God, and God, instead of laying him out, instead of blistering him, instead of bullying him like Job said he would, he says, who is this? There's almost a note of like that fatherly pride, if you can call it that, with God, that we heard back in chapter 1, when God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? I mean, Job has said some harsh and foolish things, but he did persevere. And he wasn't giving up his desire to have a relationship with God. He's been wounded in the battle. He's dirty. He's bloody. He's hurt. But here he is standing before God. He persevered in that desire to have that relationship with him again. So it seems to be, as God sets the tone here, that he's making clear that Job has mostly passed the test. God's tone is definitely stern, but it's not condescending. It's not harsh. He won't excuse some of the things that Job has said, but he's not at all the divine bully that Job had said he would be. Now, there is this note of challenge where he says, dress for action like a man. He's saying, all right, Job, we're getting ready to spar here, but he's engaging him more like he's a worthy challenger and not like he's the scum of the earth. So God condescends to him here with love and grace. This is not what Job expected. And then God goes on and he starts asking Job questions, which is what you do when you want to draw someone out, when you want to open a dialogue. He's not out to humiliate Job. He's not out to own Job. He's inviting Job in, and he's speaking to him like his friend spoke to him. And he's far more kind than Job ever thought he would be. So pause there for a second and take that in. I mean, Job has been praying and sharing some serious accusations about God and the way that he runs this place. And when God speaks to Job, he's kind. At least far kinder than Job's words deserved. So maybe you've been just inwardly raging against God. God, I thought you would do something with my life that you have not done. I thought you would fill me up and make me happy all the time. That hasn't been my experience. I thought you'd give me that happy family life, and it has been the opposite of my experience. You've made my life worse than I expected you to make it. You were supposed to answer my prayers, and I've been praying for a spouse for 10 years or a job for 10 years. The answers aren't coming. Clarity, guidance doesn't seem like it's coming. You're pouring all of this out, and you're feeling like there's this increased anger that's creating an increased gap between you and God, and that if you ever did go back to him, you feel like he would just lay you out. But what if when you return, you find a God who's kind, who's eager to forgive, who never stopped for 1 second pursuing you with his steadfast love? What if this dark view of God that you've developed has just been totally wrong? And Jesus said in Matthew 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And remember, Jesus is God among us. So when we want to know what is God like, we look at Jesus. He's got the exact imprint of the nature of God on him. And so when we want to know what is God like, we can look at him and see it most clearly. And in Jesus, he's gentle with us. In Jesus, he condescends to us. In Jesus, he's far kinder than we deserve, and he wants to give rest to our souls. So don't paint for yourself a false picture of God and then use that picture as the reason that you can never return to him. The picture of God that's been painted for us is a picture of Jesus. And he's gentle and wants to give us rest for our souls. And so that's the first thing that we should see in God's response to Job here that helps rebuild our trust in God, that God is far kinder than we deserve. And then he goes on and he starts to question Job. Job 38, verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Remember Job's accusation. He had said, God is the cruel destroyer of the earth. And here God says, I founded the earth. I laid its foundations. And he starts using these architectural metaphors to show his care and his attentiveness to creation. He's the kind creator. He's not the cruel destroyer. And when God created everything, the angels who were there didn't watch on and tremble because this great chaos monster created a world of chaos. They sang for joy because the divine, attentive architect perfectly laid its foundations and created something that's very good. So we need to know this, to restore our trust and our faith in God, that God is kinder than we deserve, and that he is attentive as creator and not at all as the destroyer. He's not the agent of chaos that Job had pictured him as. And as God asks all these questions of Job, one of the intents behind them is to reinforce the fact that God is bigger than Job and that God understands things that Job could never understand, that Job doesn't even have the capacity to understand. That's why he asked these questions like, were you there when I when I set up the foundations of the earth? Can you measure it? Because I can do that. God is establishing himself as the one who is wise and Job as the one who's small. And this is a big part of us restoring our trust in God, is to understand that God does understand things that we can't understand. He can tell the end from the beginning. He knows how the calamity in our life fits into his plan, and we don't know that. And we're very small compared to him being very big. That's part of the answer that God gives here. It's not the whole answer, though. 12 years ago, I preached through Job at Grace Road, and I essentially saw this as the only answer that God gave to Job. That Job railed against God and his good governance of creation, and God said, Job, were you there when I made it all? No? Okay, then be quiet. And Job comes on, he says, God, you allowed all these terrible things to happen in my life, and God says, but I can make ostriches. And Job says, you can make ostriches, I'll shut up. And so that was kind of like the one conclusion I saw in this. God is big and we're small, so let's just shut up. But there's way more to it than that. It's part of the answer, but it's just one part. And in fact, it wasn't even the part that Job needed the most, because Job never really argued with the fact that God's big and he's small. He was actually frustrated with the fact that a God who is so big and knows so much was allowing this much calamity in his life. How could this God who is so big and is omnipotent allow these things to happen? Job didn't need that much to be reminded of God's bigness and his smallness. So he needed it reinforced like we all do, but he wasn't ever arguing against that. So God's answer to us in our tragedy is not only to humble us and remind us of our smallness. That helps, that's part of it. But there's more to it than that. He wants to show us that he's kinder than we think, that he's more attentive to his creation than we think, and that he's far above us and can comprehend the things that we can't comprehend, and that therefore we're not in a position to be his judge. So Job 38:8, he says, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it and set bars indoors, and said, 'Thus far shall you come, and no farther. And here shall your proud waves be stayed.'" We'll talk more about the sea in the book of Job in a couple of weeks, but for now, it's just good to know that the sea symbolized chaos for them. Which makes sense, because especially in their minds, there was nothing bigger than the ocean. There was nothing more mysterious than the ocean. It was very vast. It was very unpredictable. And could there be anything more terrifying than being out on a boat in the middle of an ocean and a storm comes up? I mean, you are at that thing's mercy. You're totally helpless. The sea is uncontrollable, mysterious, unpredictable. It's chaotic. It's like the biggest monster there is out there. There's a lot that scares us about the sea. In verse 8, God says, "I shut it in with doors." He contained that chaos. In verse 9, he says, "I swaddled it with darkness." This is supposed to paint an almost absurd picture in our minds of God swaddling the sea like a baby, wrapping it in swaddling cloths. I remember when our kids were babies, they would cry and fuss and rage, and we would come up and we would swaddle them to subdue them, wrap them tight and calm them down and constrain them. Now, this was 15 years ago, and I know parenting advice changes every 6 months, so maybe that's like really bad now, I don't know. We may have messed our kids up, but that's kind of inevitable. But either way, we used to do that. We would swaddle them, and we would even engage in some pretty light parental mockery while we would do it sometimes, where it's like, "Oh, you're so mad. Oh, yeah, you're so strong and so mad." And then we'd wrap them up and hold them and calm them and subdue them. And the picture that we're supposed to see here is God does that with the ocean. That there's a hurricane raging out on the sea, and God says, "Oh, you're so mad?" And he wraps it up and contains it. God contains and constrains and subdues the chaos. Verse 11, he says, "To the waves of the ocean, you can come this far, but no farther." So within God's creation, there is evil, there is chaos, but it's not unlimited. It doesn't run amok. It's limited by God, it's controlled. It isn't all there is to creation. God is kinder than we thought, he's more attentive than we thought, he's bigger than we thought, and chaos and evil are limited by God. Those are not unlimited forces out in his creation. Then verse 12, he says, "Have you commanded the morning since the days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth and the wicked can be shaken out of it? It's changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken." So in their day, and it's not too dissimilar from our day, most really evil deeds were done at night. Thieves would break in and steal at the night and then sneak off into the darkness so you'd never know who did it. Adulteries would happen under the cover of darkness. Secret plots that people made to do evil were hatched in the night so nobody would see the perpetrators coming and going. I mean, even today, we wake up and we read the news to see what happened last night. We know that there's a lot of evil that's done under the cover of darkness. In these verses here, it says that every day, God gives an order to the morning. He sets the dawn in its place. And it says that he does that so that he can make creation almost like a skirt that's been covered in crumbs that he can shake the evil out of to limit the deeds of evildoers for another day. So they can do some evil at night, but at a certain point, God says, this far and no farther, gives an order to the morning, sets the dawn in its place, and now there can be good. And this says two things for us: to know about God in our suffering, and to know about his creation, to know about our lives and our suffering. One is that there is still a lot of good in God's creation. Remember, Job in his suffering ceased to see that. Back in chapter 3, verse 9, he's saying, let those stars be dark. He looked at all of creation and he says, this didn't work. Can we shut this thing down now? Like, I know you did all that, let there be light thing. Okay, let there be darkness. We're done. Turn it off. It didn't work. But God's saying here, it's not all bad. There is darkness, but there's also dawn. I mean, we're Western New Yorkers, so we have the regular annual rhythm of enduring long, hard winters that usually end around Memorial Day. And then we start saying things toward the end of winter like, people were not meant to live in a climate like this. Like, whose wagon broke down so that we all settled here? And we get vitamin D deprived. We get depressed. We all start looking at Florida houses on Realtor.com because Rochester is unlivable. But then summer hits. And summer is glorious. I mean, it's just right. Summer here is the best in the world. It's just hot enough in the daytime. It's just cool enough at night. Everything stays green most summers. When we push dinners out onto the deck, our family just lives outside in the summer. Summer is amazing. Rochester is the best place to live. And it's easy in winter to almost not be able to fathom going outside in shorts and having sunshine on your skin. It's almost like, I remember that, but what would that be like? And it's easy to think that that doesn't exist here until it does. And when we experience especially long and protracted suffering, or we've got evil around us, there's evil in our lives, it's easy for us to start to think that that's all there is in God's creation. That it's only always winter. But God here acknowledges there is real evil, there is real pain, there is real suffering. He doesn't deny that those things exist, but he does deny that that's everything. He denies that that's everything now because every morning he causes a dawn to happen, and it certainly won't be everything at the end of the story. And there's a lot of beauty and goodness in God's creation. And if our picture of God, if we see him as a chaos monster who spends his days hunting us, we're getting it totally wrong. Because he's a God who didn't create the evil that's in his creation, but does restrain it, and who gives order to the morning every day to shake it out. And as much as suffering is real, there's an awful lot of beauty and goodness in his creation and in our lives that can make it worth it. And again, these are all partial answers. None of these things are the whole thing. And I know there's some objections to each one of these. So it's really going to be a 3-week picture that we try to paint here. But I think we all experience, we've all experienced the grief and pain when somebody that we know and love dies. We go through the loss. We go through that grieving process. But if we were offered an opportunity, you can have them back for 1 week. But at the end of that week, you have to lose them again. You have to go through all the grief and all the loss and all the pain again. Would you do it? And I think most of us would say that 1 week would make the grief worth it. The beauty of that week, the memories that we'd have that week, the conversations we'd have that week, those would be good enough that I'd be willing to go through that suffering again. What God's saying here is that there is a lot of that goodness in creation. Yet there is suffering. But that's not all there is. God limits the evil. God limits evil people. He limits evil as a force. He limits the evil ones who would do evil. Those things don't just run amok. It isn't always dark. God turns on the lights so that evildoers have to scatter like roaches for at least another day because evil is limited. And every sunrise for us is a reminder of God's goodness. So what do we have here so far to help us in our suffering? A reminder that God is kinder than we deserve and condescends to us. A reminder that God is attentive to his creation and he hasn't taken off. A reminder that he is far above us. He's big and we're small, and he can comprehend things that we can't comprehend, so we're not in a position to be his judge. A reminder that chaos and evil are limited and constrained and swaddled by God. A reminder that there's still a lot of good in creation and that even evil people are limited by God. Job got a lot right in this book, but he got his picture of God profoundly wrong at times. And yet God sternly but kindly draws Job out, pulls Job in, and shows Job that he is far better, far kinder, far more in control, and way better than Job ever could have seen. So an application for us. Do you think that after these many years of raging against God, that if you tried coming back to him now, that he'll just shut you up and own you? Because if you return to him, you return to him in Jesus. And in Jesus, we find a God who's far kinder than we expected. When you're going through profound suffering, do you think that chaos reigns? And have you considered that you haven't seen the whole story? That you haven't looked at all of creation? And this is not to deny the very real storm you're in, but that storm is not the sum of all reality, and that's not the whole of your story, even though it might feel that way as you're going through it. And could it be that the perception that you've developed that God doesn't care, that God isn't involved, that God is disinterested, could that just be wrong? And are you so wise to know what God is like better than what his own word says he's like? And could that feeling you have that God is absent just be inaccurate? And if, like Job, you start to think of God as a merciless hunter, an insidious spy, a capricious destroyer, and a sinister ruler, do you maybe need to replace that picture with the picture of a kind redeemer? Because we will suffer. I mean, eventually it will be some suffering that takes all of us out. We will die from the chaos that's allowed in this creation for now. But we have hope. We have hope in our Redeemer who triumphed over the dust and rose to life again in Jesus. That, yeah, God allowed that chaos to strike him too, but God has such good control over the outcome of chaos that he turned all of that for good upon the cross. And so if Job was given these reasons to trust God again, how many more reasons were we given? We know who the Redeemer is. We know how the story ends. We know that even if our suffering that comes into our lives ends these lives, we will rise again at that new creation. And there, Revelation 21:4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. So through this book of Job, God is calling us back in. In Jesus Christ, he's come down to our level. He's condescended to us. By showing us how Job prayed and how Job spoke, he's inviting us to bring those things before him. He's inviting our questions, inviting us to bring our pain, inviting us to bring our crying and our tears, and desiring to make himself known to us in Jesus. And so if today we will bring him our raging, untamable hearts, he can swaddle them and subdue them and tell us, I've got you. Trust me. And to build and to sustain our faith, God's given us this Lord's Supper. And this is an observance for Christians that preaches the truths that are at the heart of our faith. That when we take this supper, we're saying that we have a Redeemer who stood on the earth, who went down into death, but who triumphed over death. We eat that bread to say that his body was torn for us. He died for us. When we drink the cup, we're saying that, yes, God allowed chaos to strike Jesus, the one truly righteous sufferer. And he is so kind that he spilled his blood on our behalf so that we could now approach God, not as this chaos monster, but we could approach him as a good father and as his beloved sons and daughters who were loved and accepted for all eternity because of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us on the cross. And so if you are a Christian who put your faith in Jesus, you've confessed and renounced your known sins, and you believe that the way that you can approach the Father is because of what Jesus did for you on the cross, then we would encourage you as we sing the next couple songs to take this supper, to remind yourself and to remind everybody around you that you believe that Jesus died, Jesus was buried, and Jesus rose again to unite you to the Father, that you will see him someday.